All right. Two objectives: to explain the emergence of the United States as an imperial power in the 1890s, and to trace the course of the Spanish-American War and its results. Let's begin. That's the wrong packet. In Roman numeral number 11.
Okay then.
I know, right? So if you want to personify the United States, today you use Uncle Sam, right? Before Uncle Sam, you would use, they called her Lady Liberty, or the Goddess of Freedom, right? Which is like Statue of Liberty. England has their personification of their country is this sort of round-headed man with a top hat. His name is John Bull. There's a few different ways to draw John Bull, but he's always got a top hat, and he's always sort of a round-headed man. The English think of themselves as bulldogs, as like tough and stubborn. Like you can punch a bulldog in the face and they'll just like take it. You know, they won't whimper and run away. And that's sort of the British stiff upper lip.
I'm not sure if the bulldog would feel it through all the inbreeding though. So.
Well, the English, you know. Okay. Roman numeral number 11. This sometimes surprises American history students to think of the United States this way. But the U.S. was really kind of a second-rate country for like really all of the time that we have studied American history. It was a second-rate power. When you're trying to figure out like who are the big important players in world politics, the U.S. did not make the list for most of its history, at least most of its early history. In the 1880s, it was a second-rate power. We could rival Canada. We could go get into skirmishes with Mexico, but the U.S. could not run with any European power. They were just all stronger and bigger and richer and better militaried than us. And we were really a second-rate power. This sometimes is hard for American students in the 2000s here to sort of imagine. We're so used to just being the biggest dog, you know. Yeah, we really were a second-rate power by the end of the 1800s. Somewhere around 1870, European powers, also with Japan, who was its major power in East Asia, European powers and Japan scrambled to dominate the territories of Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. You find, particularly among European powers, a feeling that they need to civilize the uncivilized people of like Africa and Asia, right? As early as 1885, the Congregationalist minister Josiah Strong was urging Protestants basically to go proselytize overseas. Now, our Lord says in the last line of St. Matthew's Gospel, what's known as the Great Commission, that you are to go forth and spread the gospel to all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and Son and Holy Spirit, and behold, I'll be with you till the end of the age. We are instructed as Christians that we are to go share the good news, the gospel. When it takes on a political element, then the story changes a little bit. So there's a feeling that like you need to go spread the gospel because our Lord told us to. It's the only way to heaven, right? I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me. So it's the way to heaven, and we're supposed to go spread the good word. When it becomes political, that's where the story changes a little bit. Josiah Strong predicted that Americans, in particular, he says the Anglo-Saxon race, which is kind of bad ethnology there. He said it would spread itself over all the earth. It's grounded in the idea of American exceptionalism and kind of manifest destiny-ish. Imperialists based their arguments on of denying citizenship to Indians and Asian immigrants kind of in this kind of hang-up of racial politics. Now, this also gets tied up with unemployment and mass protests. A lot of policymakers feared that American workers would embrace some new ideologies of socialism or communism, and so they thought that like overseas markets, that it's just good for America to rival its European brothers to go pick up some imperial powers. That it's just good for America. It's good for our economy. It's good, the thinking was for like the white race. Territorial expansion had been part of American life since well before independence. I mean, I'm thinking of like the British line that you weren't supposed to, the proclamation line that you weren't supposed to cross the Appalachian Mountains, but American colonists just kept doing it. And then in 1823, James Monroe issues the Monroe Doctrine, which basically says we're going to extend our influence in the Western Hemisphere, and that just seemed to cement it even further. Subpoint B. In 1867, William Seward, this man at the top, he was the Secretary of State under Lincoln. William Seward in 1867 bought the territory of Alaska from the Russians. He paid $7.2 million in 1867 dollars, like even converted to 2020 dollars. That's still a pretty good price, $111 billion for the whole of Alaska. But it was, what's that? 111 million, yes, thank you. 111 million, that's still a good price for Alaska, but it was ridiculed at the time. Seward was accused of just buying many, many miles of snow.
We found gold.
Gold and then oil, yeah, for sure. But the 1890s marked a significant turning point in America's relationship with the rest of the world. Most Americans who looked overseas were interested in expanded trade. They weren't really interested in territorial possessions. Americans are pretty self-conscious of the idea of a colony. That word does not sit well in the American psyche. If we do have overseas interests, Americans look at it as these are places we can do business with. We're not looking to just have a colonial footprint. So that's another thing that sort of criticizes Seward. It looks like we're picking up colonies. Now, in fairness, we bought it instead of conquering it. But it was a piece of criticism nonetheless. But it also begins to give Americans the taste of extraterritorial expansion, right? I mean, I think you look at the contiguous 48, and then you start looking like the other pieces where the American finger can reach. And that gives us the lure of empire, where a small group of late 19th century thinkers began to actively promote the idea of American expansionism. This was not mainstream thought. This is kind of the vanguard of the idea of expansionism, but eventually it will become mainstream. American policymakers saw European powers carving up the rest of the world. And they saw Africa and Asia as like a desirable piece to get. And they see European powers in arms races to build steel-plated battleships. And America began to like really feel that they were the second-class nation. They'd always sort of been aware of it, but watching how far ahead the first-class nations were surging gave America a little bit of an inferiority complex. Here's where we meet U.S. Navy Admiral Alfred T. Mahan. He was reading a history book. You know, man, history books, they're the best. They change the world. And Mahan noticed that all of the great empires of world history had pretty awesome navies. Armies are important. Armies are important, but Mahan said, when you really become a country with some swagger is when you've got a great navy. Now, of course, he is a Navy admiral, so this is really preaching to him. But he feels it. And so he wrote a book in 1890 called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. I've tried to read it. It's pretty dull. But it was pretty influential at the time, and it became one of the most important texts on warfare, and it influenced the way that America and the rest of the world militarized. I'm told you still read this if you go to officer school in the Navy. Like, you'll read Mahan's work. Urging the United States to build up the U.S. Navy, to build steel-hulled cruisers, and new modern battleships, it transformed the United States into the world's third largest naval power.
Was that after Spain and England?
Probably. I don't know the ranking, but that sounds about right. Third largest naval power, and it basically, his book was so influential that Americans are like, all right, fine, let's do this. Navy's how you do it. We're kind of feeling a little inferior. Let's do it. So Mahan pushes the U.S. into the third largest naval power. That would have been 1890. Now, let's talk about Hawaii. If we pick up Alaska by buying it, we do quite the opposite with Hawaii. The storyline is very different. And you may be sort of familiar with it. Since the 1790s, since like early America, Hawaii had been an important station for shipping when you're going westward to China and India. By the 1820s, American missionaries show up to go spread the good news of our Lord. And start setting up schools and churches in the Hawaiian Islands. The Hawaiian Islands were a kingdom. The stretch of islands that were around it were a sovereign kingdom. They had a king and a government. But by the mid-1800s, Americans owned sugar plantations in Hawaii. So it's like, you know, it's its own country, but Americans own land in that country. Like if your family had a house in Mexico, right? It's not like that house is American. It's in Mexico. It's just American owned. Yeah.
Does it count as American sovereign ground if someone from America owns that, or
No.
if the government owns it?
It's Hawaiian.
Okay.
Yeah, it's in Hawaii. And I'm glad you said that. I want to make sure we're clear on that. So it's a Hawaiian country, but Americans own the dirt on it. American plantations. And actually, they were so successful at growing sugar in Hawaii that American exports of Hawaiian sugar, so it counts as an imported item when it comes to the United States. But that made up like 75% of the wealth of the islands. So very successful sugar plantations. But it also means that like the wealth of the plantation doesn't stay in Hawaii and ends up going to American interests from there.
Paid for the export, though?
Sure. Yes, like those Hawaiian sugar plantation workers. They're killing it. And so immigrants from China, Japan, and Portugal were working on American-owned plantations, so much so that by the end of the 1800s, immigrants outnumbered native Hawaiians 3-1. An 1876 treaty between the United States and the King of Hawaii gave Hawaiian sugar tariff-free access to the American market, which spiked its production by 900%. In return, it gave Hawaii gave the United States control over Pearl Harbor, which was the best port in the kingdom. If we're exporting so much, then we set up an American Navy port in Hawaii for export to the United States. And they're exporting it tariff-free, which is pretty great if you're in the Hawaiian sugar business. 900% spike. It's pretty insane. The United States set up a Navy base at Pearl Harbor, so that's used for export, but also has a refueling station for American ships. In 1887, the King Kalakaua, his interior minister, okay, so King Kalakaua, like this guy I think is such a tragic story. He wants to establish a government that is wise and prudent and will benefit all Hawaiians. And he says, so I need some good, competent ministers around me. And so he names his cabinet, and the cabinet is full of American business interests because they're like the most savvy people in the kingdom. But they also start treating Kalakaua like a puppet because his cabinet has, in reality, a lot more power of governing than he does. So his interior minister was an American lawyer who drafted a constitution. He drafted a constitution in the model of the United Kingdom's constitutional monarchy, which would effectively strip Kalakaua of most of his power. And then it would give that power to the legislature. The legislature was elected by landowners, but American plantation owners owned most of the land, so most of the decision making in the Kingdom of Hawaii would benefit American interests. This new constitution limited voting rights to major landowners and denied the voting rights of any Hawaiians with Japanese and Chinese descent. 3,000 residents and an armed militia demanded that King Kalakaua sign this new constitution. It's known as the Bayonet Constitution, or be deposed if he doesn't sign it. And so he agreed to its terms. So essentially, he's bullied out of his own kingdom. I mean, he's still the king, and he's still serving as an administrative head, but he's just been stripped of all of his power of the kingdom. That would have been in 1887.
So how modeled after the constitutional monarchy was it? Was it pretty...
I haven't compared the constitutions, so I can't answer that with a certainty. I mean, the English Constitution is basically every law they've ever passed, so it's a little tricky. There is no Constitution of Great Britain.
The Queen has a lot of power still. She just doesn't use it, right?
No. Subpoint F. So in 1887, Kalakaua is forced to sign the Bayonet Constitution. In 1890, the United States reinstates their tariff on Hawaiian sugar. So that like it was all of the money that was coming into Hawaii suddenly stops. When they reinstate the tariff on sugar, it makes American sugar then cheaper than Hawaiian sugar, which is always the point of a tariff, to go protect your own industry. You can argue that the Hawaiian sugar that you're importing is basically American sugar because it's owned by so much American interest, but it is grown on foreign soil. So the McKinley Tariff of 1890 reinstates the tariff on sugar. It shocks the Hawaiian economy. And American sugar planters in Hawaii say, now wait a minute, we've got this country, we're totally running it with all of the power. Why don't we just ask the United States to send over a couple of those Navy destroyers that they've just built and just go capture this country? And then it'll be America, and then we don't have to pay the tariff on the sugar. How about it? Hang on. In 1891, King Kalakaua died, and his sister, Queen Liliuokalani, I think, takes power. She does not like that her brother was a puppet monarch, and basically decides that she is going to retake power for Hawaiians. The phrase was Hawaii for Hawaiians. She planned on amending that constitution to extend the franchise to broader voting rights. And before she got a chance to do that, U.S. businessmen organized a revolution in the Kingdom of Hawaii. With the unordered help of the United States Marines, they overthrew Queen Liliuokalani and set up a new government headed by Stanford B. Dole, this man with a curiously long beard for a person who lives in a tropical climate. Stanford Dole then becomes the head of this new revolutionary government. President Grover Cleveland, United States President Grover Cleveland says, oh, wait, I didn't authorize the Marines to go overthrow a foreign monarch for business reasons. Like, what the what, dude? And Cleveland ordered that Queen Liliuokalani be restored to the throne. However, Grover Cleveland was in Washington, D.C., and that's a long way away from Hawaii, and Dole essentially ignored the order. Grover Cleveland then said, okay, plan B. And he acknowledged the new government. He basically says, okay, maybe it's a legitimate overthrow. People do sometimes overthrow their monarchs. Overthrew the monarch, ordered that Queen, so he basically acknowledged the new government, but he says, we are not going to annex it. You've just overthrown the government. It's still Hawaii. It's its own country, and we're not gonna annex it unless you get a vote of Hawaiians and the majority of them want to be Americans, and then we'll annex it. Grover Cleveland, though, doesn't live forever. He's not president forever. I mean, he doesn't live forever either, but he's not president forever. And the next president was William McKinley. And McKinley did favor annexation. Congress proclaimed Hawaii a U.S. territory in 1898, even though Hawaiians never had a chance to vote on it. I look back at how the United States acquired Hawaii, and to me, it looks like Alaska, we purchased. Hawaii, we just sort of stole. Just roll in and stole a country and pull it off. Roman numeral number 12.
No one had a problem with it?
I think there were people that had problems with it. I just don't think their voice was as loud as the people that were cool with it. Roman numeral number 12. Kind of a topical shift here. In a sense, this is another question of imperialism. How does the United States grow its footprint? In Roman numeral number 12, the country of Cuba. So let us turn back to a little closer to home. Cuba had been in a fight for its own independence from its possessor of Spain. Cuba had been fighting for its own independence since 1868. And Spain was known as kind of a cruel colonial power, particularly in Cuba. There was Spain's rule had been cruel, and a lot of Americans were pretty sympathetic that just the treatment of the Cubans was pretty unfair. Cubans had made several attempts at uprising, several attempts to try to overthrow the Spanish possessors. And in 1896, Spain basically says, we are sick of Cuba trying to get independence. We're going to crush this independence movement. And so they sent Valeriano Weyler to Cuba to restore order. Weyler ordered 300,000 Cubans into concentration camps. And American newspapers at the time were trying to cover this story. And American news media just seizes on this. It basically made good stories. It made good copy. At the time, the newspapers were kind of like in an economic pinch and in a race for leadership. And so they like seize on this idea. Which brings us to subpoint B. Both the New York Journal and the New York World, they're rival newspapers. Matthew, do I need to take this away? Thanks. Both, they're rival newspapers, and both of the New York Journal and the New York World would print these exaggerated stories of how Cubans were being treated by Weyler. They called him the Butcher Weyler, his brutality. This is kind of the original fake news, what's known as yellow journalism. Yellow journalism is truthy. It's sort of true, but polished up a little bit, jazzed up a little bit. It's sensational. They would write these exaggerated stories of the news, which would lure in readers and engage them. It's kind of like when you see it, like, I know that's clickbait, but I kind of want to know what's the rest of it. That's kind of the whole newspaper industry here at the end of the 1800s. It's yellow journalism, they call it. Newspapers ran stories about how the Spanish were poisoning wells and throwing Cuban children into shark-infested waters. Newspaper reports included false names, fake dates, totally invented details. Just were all like these sensational, based on true stories, but not actually true once it hits print. And they were always saying like, oh, the government will substantiate these reports, which they never did because they never existed in the first place. But American sympathy, man, we just ate it up. We just ate it up. It's like, oh, that's those poor Cubans. And they were being brutalized, but children thrown to sharks, that doesn't exist. William Randolph Hearst. This man with the awkward center part here, the owner, William Randolph Hearst, was the owner of the New York Journal, one of the great newspapers of America. He sent in an artist. I love this guy, Frederick Remington. Scholars, bowlers remember his name. Frederick Remington was an illustrator who, okay, so like photography existed, but it was hard to run photos in newspapers, particularly, it was tricky printing, but illustrations could be cut and printed really well. Frederick Remington was a talented illustrator, and so he was hired by Hearst to go to Cuba and to get pictures of this, you know, like the Cuban Revolution and the Spanish oppression and what, like the Civil War that's brewing in Cuba. And Remington goes down there and he like sends a telegraph back to Hearst, and he says, there's not a revolution and these stories don't exist and I don't think we're gonna go to war. Hearst replies, this is a great line. He says, Remington, you furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war. You just go down there and draw something and we'll make a story out of it.
And we have a prize named after Pulitzer after you did all this?
Yeah, well, that was Hearst, but yes, yeah, Pulitzer, kind of in a similar business, yeah. These giants of the newspaper business, yellow journalism was sort of seedy. Remington, one of the great American artists of his day, he was also a sculptor. If you know the sculpture, they call it the Bronco Buster. It's the cowboy who's riding on like a bucking horse. That's a Remington, it's a bronze sculpture. The Bronco Buster is what it's called. That's a Remington sculpture. Anyway, great artist. Subpoint C. President Cleveland had no interest in supporting a Cuban rebellion. So President Cleveland is not interested at all in what's going on in Cuba from an American point of view. Like, he might be interested as a human, but like as the President of the United States, he had no interest in supporting the Cuban rebellion. But he did worry that Spain wasn't actually putting it down and that this was going to be a lingering situation real close to that. I mean, Cuba is 90 miles off of the shore of Florida. It's pretty close. So Cleveland was like, that's disrupting trade. It's hard to get, you know, Americans have some land and some sugar plantations on Cuba. You've got a civil war maybe brewing there. But Cleveland is reluctant to get into it. But Cleveland, of course, is not president forever. And William McKinley took office in 1897 and took a tougher stance. He wanted to find a diplomatic way to bring peace to Cuba. But McKinley said, if we can't do it diplomatically, then we'll do it with bullets. We'll threaten force if we have to. We want peace, and we'll go to war to get it. His threat to that the United States would step in if Spain could not ensure an early and certain peace actually seemed to work, which was kind of a surprise because, I mean, we had a navy, but listen, the third largest naval power is not the rival of the largest naval power. And if the United States tangles with Spain, I mean, you look at it on paper and we don't win that war. But McKinley is like threatening, we're going to go to war if you don't settle this. And Spain actually appears to capitulate. Spain's conservative regime fell apart. They offered Cuba some limited self-rule. They said, you know, you're still going to be a colony, but we'll give you some self-governance. The butcher Weyler was recalled back to Spain. They basically take the worst agitator and send him back home. And all of the concentration camps were closed. This sounds to me like an American win. This sounds like America goes in there, shows our sword, brandishes our weapon, and Spain's like, oh yeah, okay, fine. We're, you know, uncle, right? But Spanish loyalists in Havana rioted against the proposal of this new Spanish government. And Cuban rebels said, we don't want limited self-governance. We want independence. And both the Spanish agitators and the Cuban agitators reject this capitulation that McKinley negotiates. That would have been in late 1897. In February 1898, the New York Journal, Pulitzer's newspaper, published a private letter which was intercepted. The private letter was coming from Enrique Dupuy de Lome, who was the Spanish minister to the United States. De Lome is Spanish. He's working in the United States. He's the ambassador to America. And he sends a letter back to Spain, to his government in Spain. And this letter starts like belittling McKinley. They're like, you guys, you don't have to give in to him. He's kind of a nincompoop. He's weak. He's swayed by public opinion. Like, he's not a strong figure. You don't have to give in to him. The letter, like, pissed off Americans. Once Pulitzer publishes this, Americans are like, what? You're making fun of you're a minister in our country. You don't insult our president in our country. Spain's like, yeah, De Lome, you shouldn't have done that. They fired him. Spain apologized for the letter, but Americans felt insulted. Our dander was up, and Spain was the bad guy. That was in February of 1898. Just a few days later, the USS Maine, which had been ordered into Cuba to go evacuate U.S. citizens in what looked like a civil war, the USS Maine exploded in Havana's harbor. It exploded and sunk. 260 men on board were killed. Americans immediately suspected that the Spanish had mined the harbor and had blown up the ship in a sabotage, in a act of war. Sea mines exist, in Finding Nemo, or like, oh, party balloons, right? Those are real things. They actually exist, and they actually blow up boats. And this looks like Spain is getting into a new snit with America. It comes right after the De Lome letter. The Spanish government immediately commissions an investigation. Government of Spain immediately commissions an investigation. They send in divers. They go and look at all the reports. Who ordered the explosion of the sea mine? And they concluded that none of the characteristics of the explosion suggested sea mines. That none of the conditions in the harbor that day would have suggested if a sea mine blows up, you also get a crap load of dead fish. Like the collateral damage of the fish that were in the harbor, like they would all be dead. And they say that basically that didn't happen. None of this looks like a sea mine. The Spanish then divers down into the wreck, and what they decide was that the ship's coal bunker, so its fuel storage, accidentally ignited, which happened sometimes. When you're a steamship and you have all that explosive fuel on board and something happens, sometimes it does explode. The Spanish report, though, was entirely unreported in the American press. McKinley, President McKinley, who's been accused of being weak, who's been insulted by the Spanish press, orders his own investigation. He says, you know what, this doesn't look like a sea mine. He was generally thought that it was an accident. But the United States Navy convened a board of inquiry. The board of inquiry found that the keel of the boat, which is it's the long piece that runs underneath the ship, is the keel. It's like what holds the boat together. It's the frame of the ship. The keel had been broken in half in what looked like an external explosion. They concluded that a mine under the ship also caused a secondary explosion inside the coal and then ammunition holds of the ship. The Board of Inquiry report was reported in the American press, and Americans read that and were pissed about it. Now, since then, this has been a well-investigated site, and divers have gone back to it again and again, and that investigations today generally show that the ammunition hold exploded, but it's still a little unclear if the explosion started outside or inside of the ship. The conventional wisdom is the Spanish were right. The explosion happened inside the ship, and then it lit the ammunition hold. But the evidence is pretty inconclusive. It would be unlikely of the Spanish to do that. There's just really no advantage for them to go pick a fight. But the evidence isn't super clear. Subpoint E, Nevertheless, newspapers ran with the idea that it's the Spanish are the bad guys. They blew up the boat. William Randolph Hearst offered a $50,000 reward for the capture of the Spaniards who were responsible. Hesitant business leaders became impatient, believing that, like, maybe we should just go to war and end this problem because we're trying to do business in Spain and they've got a simmering civil war. Let's make it an actual war and get this over with. Public opinion solidified with the phrase, "Remember the Maine," and people would cheer back, "To hell with Spain." On March 27th, McKinley he sent an ultimatum to Madrid. He says, the United States is going to argue an immediate armistice. Basically, both sides in this civil war will stop fighting. The United States is going to mediate it, and we're going to bring peace. Spain agrees to every demand. Spain just like capitulates and totally gives in on this. Except they won't give up Cuba to be its own country. There was like this legend in Spain that Cuba had almost like magical powers in the Spanish Empire, that as soon as they lose Spain, the Spanish Empire, the great empire, would collapse and they would lose all of their overseas territories. It was like this mythical power of Cuba. So on April 11th, McKinley asked Congress for declaration of war, and by April 20th, the U.S. Congress agrees, and the United States picks its first intentional battle with a European power. The first battle of the Spanish-American War doesn't occur in Cuba, which is kind of the natural place for it to occur, right? I mean, why wouldn't it start in Cuba? That's clearly where the fight is. We can get our boats there the fastest. It's 90 miles away. We can get it there. The first battle of the Spanish-American War did not take place in Spain, which is another logical place for it to take. Instead, inexplicably, the first battle of the Spanish-American War takes place in the Philippines. The wrong hemisphere, right? But it's Spanish territory, and the thinking is like, nobody's going to see us coming. Nobody saw us coming. Commodore George Dewey sent the U.S. fleet into Manila Harbor on April 30th so they could attack the Spanish Navy where they weren't expecting it. They trapped the entire Spanish fleet in the Philippines. Basically, the whole Pacific fleet was in the Philippines. Dewey traps them into the harbor, and then at daybreak opens fire. The attack was so intense, the United States warships just like lobbing missiles and bombs into the harbor. It was so thick that like the explosion smoke, we couldn't even see what we were shooting at anymore. It was just like, keep firing, keep firing. And then like some munitions clerk, it's like looking at his list, he's like, oh crap, we've about shot every bullet we have. If they return fire, we're screwed. And so Dewey's like, hold your fire, hold your fire. Like, don't shoot at all. The smoke clears. They find out that the Spanish will not be returning fire because Dewey has sunk the entire fleet. The entire Spanish Pacific fleet is now on the floor of the ocean underneath the harbor of Manila.
And they also made the harbor much bigger after.
I don't know. Dewey's victory allows U.S. troops to land in the Philippines. Now, it's worth noting, Philippines, Spanish territory, similar in the Philippines to what's going on in Cuba. Tough colonial rule, Filipinos basically wanting to like become independent, reject Spanish rule. And there's a rebel leader, I love this guy's name, Emilio Aguinaldo. He's a Filipino rebel leader, and basically he's trying to lead the insurrection to overthrow the Spanish. The Americans show up, Aguinaldo sees what Dewey's doing, and Aguinaldo's like, yes, down with the Spanish, and takes this like guerrilla warfare, not guerrillas, but like guerrilla warfare, and like starts aiding the U.S. Marines into the overtake of the Philippine Islands. Now, a lot of Americans believed that once you destroyed Spanish rule, there would be social reform and political self-government. That's actually McKinley's position. McKinley is not an imperialist. He wants to see peace in the world. He's ready to use American power to go get, independence for oppressed people. He's not a colonialist. Until the U.S. shows up in the Philippines, and he's like, dang, that was easy. Easy. And we should just keep this set of islands for ourselves. Like, that would be pretty sweet, because this was not even a tough fight. So McKinley switches from an anti-imperialist to start thinking like, imperialism, maybe I'm in. Maybe that sounds fun. So Aguinaldo, who originally helped the Americans overthrow the Spanish, suddenly is like, wait a minute, no, independence, America? You're not supposed to be a colonialist. So Aguinaldo's like, crap, now I have a new enemy to fight. And so Aguinaldo switches to lead a guerrilla war now against the Americans who have showed up and were kind of thinking about keeping this land for themselves. The McKinley administration's like, man, I don't know. I think we should be here. We have a responsibility. Just his phrase was, this is such an unfortunate phrase. He says, hey, we have an obligation to our little brown brothers to go spread Christianity. Now, it's worth noting that the Philippines had been Christian since the 1500s, when like Catholic missionaries arrived there in the Renaissance. But McKinley's like, well, yeah, we're gonna go Christianize them. In McKinley's defense, he's talking about Protestant Christianity, and a lot of Protestants, particularly at the time, just didn't see Catholicism as a Christian religion. Subpoint H. Let us turn backwards to Cuba. Turn our eyes back to Cuba. The United States presence in Cuba began with the naval blockade, similarly trying to back the Spanish fleet into the harbor of Santiago de Cuba. Unlike the U.S. Navy, the U.S. Army was not the biggest and most powerful. They were not the third largest in the nation. The U.S. Army was actually a pretty small country. A small professional force, mostly made up of ill-prepared and undersupplied volunteers. 125 Americans volunteered to go fight in Cuba, but there actually weren't enough guns to equip that army. The uniforms were also left over from the Civil War, heavy wool uniforms, which were poorly outfitted for tropical Cuba. The officers, they got 125,000 volunteers, and they got to go get trained. The officers of the United States Army were more excited about telling Civil War stories, like, let me tell you how it was, we fought a Battle of Manassas, than they were interested in training their soldiers. And so those troops go into battle ill-prepared and under-equipped. There's stories that like they didn't have enough rifles, so they just handed them like broomsticks and say, pretend it's a rifle. It's hard to get your target shooting in. It's sure. All right. In June of 1898, 17,000 U.S. troops landed in the harbor of Santiago de Cuba, including a group known as the Rough Riders. The Rough Riders were volunteer cavalry under the direction of Leonard Wood and Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt had been the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He'd had a little desk job in New York as a Secretary of the Navy, but he resigned from his desk job to go take a command position in the Army because he thought that war was just kind of fun and manly and that just people should do it if they can every now and then. I love Teddy Roosevelt. He's like, every now and then you just got to go to war. It's good for a country. Makes you tough. And so he takes up direction of a cavalry unit known as the Rough Riders. On July 1st of 1898, the most famous battle in Cuba took place near the capital of Santiago. The first part of the battle was on a hill known as Kettle Hill, with a risky uphill charge by 2 African-American regiments and the Rough Riders. Kettle Hill was far more important to the Spanish-American War in Cuba than its more famous little brother, San Juan Hill. So the Rough Riders played kind of a minor role in Kettle Hill, but Kettle Hill was a more important battle. They go take Bunker Hill, or not, San Juan Hill, and it was less important. Yeah, Bunker Hill, it's in Boston. They go and they take San Juan Hill. It's a less important position, but basically Roosevelt doesn't have to share the credit. And that's what Roosevelt likes the best, being in the center of the photograph, being the guy who's like the leader of the campaign. So 2 days later, the Spanish fleet tried to escape the American blockade in the harbor, which led to a naval battle, which essentially destroys the entire Spanish fleet in the Caribbean.
What happened to them being like the most powerful navy in the world? They just keep nuking them.
Well, there's no nukes yet, but yeah.
Yeah. Bombing.
Yeah, sorry, spoiler alert.
Spoiler alert, nukes are a thing.
Shortly thereafter, United States troops invaded Puerto Rico. The Spanish did have a lot of power, but it was also becoming an antiquated navy. It wasn't a modern navy, and basically you get modern weapons even against a bigger force, if the bigger force was just not as strong.
What type of ships were they? Were they still the wooden?
It would have been a mix. Yeah, it's kind of in that transition time. Subpoint J, the Treaty of Paris. I think I've mentioned this before. If you're ever playing a trivia game and you need to name a treaty and you don't actually know what the treaty is, just go with Treaty of Paris. There's been a lot of them, somewhere around 30 treaties of Paris. Most of them don't involve the French at all. They're just a safe place to go surrender. I guess because the French won't threaten you. Because the French are kind of bad at war. Did he say that? I didn't. Okay.
They're also bad at revolutions as well.
Well, somebody said that like the greatest military victory was the French Revolution, but it doesn't count because the opponent was also French.
That's about right, yeah.
Spain and the United States at the Treaty of Paris signed an armistice. An armistice is an agreement to quit shooting, but it doesn't mean that the war is ended. So they agree to sign an armistice in August, and then they're going to go meet in Paris to go make a treaty. Secretary of State John Hay, I love this guy. I love his beard with like goatee out front. It's like the goatee on top of the beard. It's a great look. I can't pull it off. It's like part Colonel Sanders, part beard. Okay. John Hay, Secretary of State, his line was, "It's a splendid little war," because the whole of the Spanish-American War took about 15 weeks. They fought it from beginning to end in 4 months and crippled Spain and pushes America. This is kind of why the Spanish-American War is important. It's America's emergence onto the world scene. We go from kind of a minor power who can threaten Canada, whoop-de-doo, to can roll with the big dog traditional powers of Europe. Spain, in the Treaty of Paris, freed Cuba, gave it totally its independence. They handed Guam and Puerto Rico to the United States, basically said that these countries, we just surrender them. This is the way that treaties used to be negotiated. It's basically like, hey, we're going to keep kicking your A unless you start handing us cash and land. It's like, okay. So Spain gives the United States Puerto Rico and Guam. They sell the Philippines for $20 million, and that's what Cuba gets out of it. So it's the Treaty of Paris. It started a debate over imperialism, and is this really the future for America? We are not an imperial power until the Spanish-American War, and then it kind of looks like we're ready to go play this game. Whether it was right to annex the Philippines. Opponents said imperialism is wrong politically, morally, economically, but the treaty was ratified by Congress and gives the United States a two-hemisphere empire. Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. It also brought with it American racial baggage, the concept of what's known as the white man's burden, that it's like just up to white people to go civilize the rest of the world. They call it the white man's burden. And it's not American. This is something that Actually, we start to see it initiated in Great Britain. I'm blanking. Jungle Book. Rudyard Kipling actually writes a poem called The White Man's Burden about how it's just the responsibility to go civilize all these non-white people who are clearly not civilized. It's not uniquely American, but Americans, we buy into it. America's triumphant entry into the ranks of imperial powers sparked an intense debate over the relationship between democracy and race and citizenship. In 1900, we pass an act known as the Foraker Act, which ends military rule in Puerto Rico and sets up some independent government there. It declared Puerto Rico to be an insular territory, which was different from territories in the West. Basically, from the beginning, we agree that Puerto Rico is not going to be a state. It's an insular territory. It's insulated from everything else. We're just there for its military power and whatever trade it has, but mostly its military position. That the United States wants a Caribbean base where we can influence South American imports into the United States. There's also a feeling that soon there will be a Panama Canal. We're not in that business yet, but we're anticipating it. And we want a shipping place to go control the Caribbean from there.
Hasn't Puerto Rico voted to become a state multiple times as well?
No,
it's kind of complicated. Yeah.
So that says Hawaii was made a state in 1959. So when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, Hawaii wasn't even a state.
Correct. Correct.
Because they turned it into a territory.
Yeah. Yeah. Correct. Just military base in Hawaii. It was not a state. Yep. In the 20th century, these territories would follow different paths. Hawaii would get statehood, the Philippines would get its independence, and Puerto Rico would remain as a semi-autonomous territory where they are American citizens, but only sorta. Like, Puerto Ricans don't vote for president. They're not on the map. They're American citizens and they get American protections, but they don't get all the privileges because only the states vote.
Don't they have a representative in Congress but they can't vote on
It's a non-voting representative, yeah. So they're there, they can participate in the debates, but they can't vote for anything. Correct. There's a few positions like that. Washington, D.C. has one, and American Samoa. You know, there's a few positions. Okay. That's awesome.